So now we're going to continue with righteousness. And so this will be the second part. And we're picking up at page 5 where we left off. And I'll just go ahead and begin. Now it's going to start getting into some Christian ideas. And this is output from either Microsoft Copilot or Google Gemini. And yeah, so because the predominant voice in the West is the Christian perspective, it likes to spit out like Christian perspectives on things. You almost have to ask it to specifically not speak about Christian ideas if you're asking about what's going on in the Bible, because it sees the Christian canon of the Bible as the Bible. So you have to restrict it to the Hebrew Tanakh or something like that. But I think it's important to correct misconceptions, to go ahead and cover some of the Christian perspective on righteousness, because it's a direct attack on Judaism. The New Testament most commonly translates the Hebrew word tzaddik, meaning righteous or just, into the Greek word dikaios. Depending on the context, English translations like the ESV, NIV, or KJV render this Greek term into three primary English words. Righteous, the most frequent translation, applied to people, God's character, or ethical behavior. Just, often used when discussing judgment, fairness, or legal, moral rectitude. Innocent, used in narratives where a person is declared guiltless or free from moral wrongdoing. Key biblical examples: Joseph in Matthew chapter 1 verse 19. Joseph is described as a just dikaios man when deciding how to handle Mary's pregnancy. Jesus in 1 John chapter 2 verse 1, Jesus Christ, sick, so-called, is referred to as the righteous, ho dikaios. God in Romans chapter 3 verse 26, God is called both just, dikaios, and the justifier. Which figures does the New Testament refer to with this term, I ask it? The New Testament applies the Greek equivalent of tzaddik, dikaios, to a specific select group of individuals. In a theological sense, the New Testament famously claims that none is righteous on their own merit, Romans chapter 3 verse 10. However, it explicitly bestows this title upon several prominent figures to highlight their exemplary character, faith, or relative innocence. So, I mean, the existence of these people in the Christian New Testament completely disproves, the Christian assertion that none is righteous, no, not one, that kind of thing. Or that righteousness was impossible through works of the law. That's not what the Tanakh says, and it's not even what the Christian scriptures say before Jesus is crucified. Somehow, after Jesus is crucified, it seems like righteousness becomes impossible by the works of the law in the Christian scriptures, because the Hebrew Tanakh does not cover the first century time period. So the Christian perspective is that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the tzaddik in the New Testament. He is referred to as the perfectly righteous one by both his followers and secular observers. The righteous one, Peter and Stephen both call Jesus the holy and righteous one, Acts chapter 3 verse 14 and Acts chapter 7 verse 52. Pontius Pilate's wife, she warns her husband, have nothing to do with that righteous man. Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. You know, that's part of the whitewashing of the Roman elite to make them look like their hands are so clean of the blood of the righteous, when the first century historical context is exactly the opposite, that Romans were slaughtering Jews, Torah-observant Jews, willy-nilly down through Galilee and into Judea. The Roman centurion, at the crucifixion, the centurion declares, certainly this man was innocent, dikaios, or righteous. Luke chapter 23, verse 47. Old Testament figures, when looking back at Israel's history, the New Testament writers used dikaios to validate the Hebrew Bible's view of early saints. Saints is translation, is it hagios? That's a translation of kadoshim, holy ones, set apart ones. It's, I don't think it's quite synonymous with righteous ones. Abel, Jesus calls him righteous Abel, Matthew 23, verse 35, a title echoed in Hebrews 11, verse 4. Lot, or Lot, despite his flaws in the Genesis narrative, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 through 8, which is considered probably spurious, repeatedly emphasizes that Lot was a righteous man tormented by surrounding wickedness. Figures from the Gospels, several people surrounding the life and birth of Jesus are explicitly introduced as dikaios to show they were devout keepers of the law. Joseph, husband of Mary, described as just, righteous man who sought to protect Mary from public shame, Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. You know, if Mary is just a symbol of the temple, then this Joseph could actually be Josephus, who was wanting to protect the temple from public shame. Zechariah and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, are described as righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments, Luke chapter 1, verse 6, which directly contradicts what the Pauline epistles are trying to say, that it's just not possible to achieve or attain or be righteous through performance of the works of the law. And there it is. Luke chapter 1 says, nuh-uh, because the parents of John the Baptist were. But, you know, Christians, they just don't tend to notice that. Now, we could say, well, Zechariah and Elizabeth, that was before the crucifixion, so maybe righteousness was possible by the works of the law before the crucifixion happened. I don't know. See, that would be like the opposite of what the what Christendom actually tries to portray the crucifixion as being, as being an opportunity to open up righteousness to all of humanity, when rather, from what we see from the text, if we're going by the chronology of the events depicted in the New Testament, then it would appear that actually the opposite took place, that you could only become righteous through one's faith in Jesus after his crucifixion. So it's like the door actually slammed on righteousness to all of humanity, unless they came to believe in Jesus, even if they didn't have any reason to believe in Jesus. John the Baptist, King Herod recognized John as a righteous and holy man, Mark chapter 6, verse 20. Simeon, the elderly man waiting at the temple to bless the infant Jesus, is described as righteous and devout. Luke chapter 2, verse 25. It's almost like Luke is really trying to drive this point home. Joseph of Arimathea. Now notice that this could be, as Robert Eisenman says, a garbling of Joseph bar Matthias, the Hebrew name for Flavius Josephus. Joseph of Arimathea, the man who provided the tomb for Jesus, is called a good and righteous man. Luke chapter 23, verse 50. So, would that be after the crucifixion? Luke 23:50. So this was this was after the crucifixion. Now, you could say, well, it's being biographical in saying that this Joseph, a counselor, was a good man and a just man, or a righteous one. But here he is, he's begging for the body of Jesus after the crucifixion. Luke chapter 23, near the end of the chapter. Gentile believers. Cornelius, the Roman centurion who becomes the first major Gentile convert, is described by his men as an upright, righteous person and a God-fearing man. Acts chapter 10, verse 22. So that would be after the crucifixion. Although I just read an article recently where the writer of the article wanted to suggest that based on the internal evidence, it looks like it's possible that Cornelius may have actually been a convert to Judaism, I guess, and not a Gentile, and not the first major Gentile convert. But anyway, I don't really care one way or the other, because it's talking about convert to Christianity. And if he did convert to Judaism, I seriously doubt he would have went and converted back to converted back to paganism in the form of Christianity. Anyway, we can explore individual verses further if you want. That's just a prompt from the AI. So I ask, why are no figures after Jesus' alleged... Let me make sure I'm still recording here. Why are no figures after Jesus' alleged crucifixion referred to by this term, and is it fair to say that the New Testament consolidates righteousness into the person of Jesus Christos? Okay, so it looks like Joseph of Arimathea, or Joseph bar Matthias, as the case may be, is referred to as righteous after the alleged crucifixion. So my question was based on a bit of a false premise, but anyway. So it answers, it is conceptually accurate to state that the New Testament... I see, I need yeah, here's a cough drop. I like a piece of almond or something stuck in my throat. It is conceptually accurate to state that the New Testament consolidates righteousness into the person of Jesus Christos, but the premise that no figures after the crucifixion are referred to as Tzaddik, Dikaios, requires an important linguistic nuance. Well, the narrative texts like the Gospels and Acts stop using dikaios as a biographical label for individuals after the crucifixion, the epistles shift to a corporate theological framework where all believers are collectively called the righteous. So that's only believers in Jesus, not all of the humanity. Like before Christianity, a Gentile could be considered a righteous person. But from the Christian perspective, this door appears to slam unless one comes knocking at the door and believing in Jesus and converting to Christianity. Why biographical labels disappear after the crucifixion? In the Old Testament and the Gospels, Tzaddik Dikaios was used as a descriptive label for exceptional individuals like Noah, Lot, or Joseph, who were uniquely pious or law-abiding relative to their corporate generations. Following the crucifixion and resurrection, the New Testament completely dismantles this category of individual comparative righteousness for two reasons. Universal brokenness. Epistles like Romans explicitly argue that under the law, none is righteous, no, not one. You see, I just quoted that right off the top of my head. Romans chapter 3, verse 10. The benchmark for righteousness shifts from human effort to divine perfection. A change, you know what? Except that the very act of investigating or reacting to or responding to the Christian evangelist's message is a work in itself. Choosing to believe in Jesus is a work in itself. Deciding to get baptized, that's a work in itself. Getting baptized is a work in itself. They say, oh, well, you know, baptism, that's just a sign for the community, blah, blah, blah. But it's a sign that actually, somatically represents the death of the old man and the birth of the new man. And yet, you know, evidently it was considered an important ritual by some Christians, but then some Christians evidently don't think it's important or necessary for salvation. Then why have it at all? So, let's see. A change in status. Once Jesus is introduced as the ultimate flawless tzaddik, 1 John chapter 2 verse 1, individual human piety is no longer the focus. Holiness, I don't think it ever was the focus. Individual human piety, I don't think was ever the focus because it was individual human piety. You might say, oh, well, this person, you know, he got some acclaim or some attention or some respect because he was living righteously. Well, why not? Just like a doctor who goes through med school and graduates, he receives the title doctor and he receives some respect for that. Why shouldn't a person who chooses to first live their life righteously and then actually does, why shouldn't they receive some respect, acknowledgement, some attention for that? But that's just one person, and the intention of the Torah is not for just one person to be righteous, but that all of the children of Israel would live righteously, that all the Gentiles of the nations, all the non-Jews of the nations would see the light that the children of Israel were shedding upon mankind, and that they would respond to it and choose to live righteously and succeed in living righteously. That's the aim. It's not a simple individual's righteousness as it is in Christianity, I might add. You don't say, oh, well, I guess it's game over. We won that game. Let's flip the score. Let's put another quarter in the arcade game and play again and see if we can get the high score again. It's not about that. The game is not over. It's like somewhere. It might be in the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. It says, it is not given to you to fulfill, basically like to fulfill this effort or this mission to be perfect or complete in one's observance of the commandments that the Creator gave to the children of Israel through his servant Moses, but neither is it for you to basically release yourself or dismiss yourself from this duty. So, yeah, you might not beat the game, speaking in arcade game terms, but it's also not for you to step away from the arcade game and stop playing. A change in status. Once Jesus is introduced as the ultimate flawless tzaddik in 1 John chapter 2 verse 1, individual human piety is no longer the focus. Holiness is no longer measured by being an exceptionally good person. Hold up. This is something that Christianity often doesn't get. Holiness is not the same as righteousness. Holiness has to do with being set apart for or sanctified for a certain occupation, vocation, lot. Like the high priest of Israel is of a different level of holiness than just the Kohen, the priest. It's not that because he's the high priest, he's more righteous or more good or more better than the priest. It's just that his vocation, his office, what he's been appointed to through maybe the circumstances of his birth, for example, it's that's his duty. That's what he's supposed to do, and he is set apart for that. Of course, I think there would probably be some repercussions if the high priest didn't maintain a certain level of personal righteousness, but the high priest is appointed to perform certain rituals, and because he's I don't want to say pre-selected or predetermined, but because he's the man for that job, that puts him at a higher level of holiness, and I think brings him in a closer proximity to the revelation of the Creator. That doesn't mean that the housewife down the street who maybe in her spare time is weaving, like, I don't know, coutonnets, whatever that word is, like different garments or mantles, and she's doing that to make extra money to feed her family. That doesn't mean that the high priest is more righteous than she is. Holiness is about sanctification and being set apart for a certain thing, right? So don't think that the word holiness means righteousness. It's a separate thing. So I'll just correct this and say righteousness is no longer measured by being an exceptionally good person compared to your neighbors. It is evaluated against the perfect standard of Christos, or Christ. So here the accusation is it's no longer measured by being an exceptionally good person compared to your neighbors. Now this is a charge that Paul levels Where does Paul say those who measure themselves against themselves? 2 Corinthians 10:12, blue letter. And I really should go Revised Standard. So first they said of Paul, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. I think there are other translations there that could be helpful. Let me see. Bibles. And his speech contemptible, or his speeches are worthless, and his speaking amounts to nothing. That's a pretty good characterization of Paul's ramblings in the epistles at sometimes. But anyway, but he says, let such people understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. Not that we venture to class or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. So that's his accusation there, is that people who measure themselves against their peers, they're, that's kind of not what you want to do. Now, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where do the Dead Sea Scrolls say that members of the community were in competition with one another in performing good works or deeds? The Dead Sea Scrolls state that members of the community should be in competition with one another regarding good works in the community rule, specifically 1QS column 5 lines 22 through 23. In this text, the members are instructed to live a communal life characterized by mutual love, truth, and righteous deeds, and they are expressly commanded to vie with one another or compete in the performance of good works and deeds. Now, from my outsider perspective, observing Hasidic Jews, traditional Torah observant Jews, but of the Hasidic variety, it seems to me that they still do this. And you have to consider that's actually good for the community as a whole. Because if you're to look at the other end of the spectrum, if you were to take the clerks or mall rats end of the perspective, end of the spectrum rather, where everyone's trying to outdo one another to be more of a slacker and like more of a ne'er-do-well, to do as little work as possible while still collecting your paycheck, then that is not good for a franchise or a company or whoever those clerks or mall rats work for, right? But if you want your company to excel, you want your associates, your employees, to compete with one another in excellence and to outperform one another to the extent that you can see where the cream is rising to the top, so that you can look to see which ones might be future leaders who can replace the leaders that are either dying out or leaving the company or retiring, etc. You've got to keep the leadership renewed, and it's a good idea to do that because associates or employees get resentful if you bring in talent from outside the company into leadership roles, because then you're telling these associates that they have nowhere to climb up the ladder. Now, the companies will justify this practice by saying, well, none of the people that we have are exemplifying themselves or seeking excellence sufficiently or seeking the responsibility of leadership, so we had to recruit from outside the company. So then what we have to conclude from this is that it's really up to the employees and the associates to pursue excellence and to compete with one another in excellence in order to fill those leadership roles and to reinforce the perception that the company will promote from within. And all of that is for the strength of the company, or in this case, for the strength of a community, a religious community, or in this case, the strength of the people, the children of Israel, or in this case, the strength of the world, humanity. And that's why and I think I even bring this up, maybe not here, we'll see. But we should continue. So I ask, is righteous, or rather it's answering, is righteousness consolidated into Christos? Yes, it is entirely fair to say the New Testament consolidates righteousness into Jesus Christos. In Pauline and Yochanan theology, Jesus does not just act righteously, he becomes the definition and source of righteousness itself. Now, if you compare the things that Jesus taught and did, some people who are much more knowledgeable in Torah than your typical Gentile have criticisms about things that Jesus said and did, saying that they're not in alignment with the Torah. So that maybe he wasn't as righteous as Gentiles have been led to believe. The great exchange in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 21, Paul writes that God made Christos to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Righteousness is no longer generated by human behavior, it is an attribute belonging to Christos that is extended to humans. So here it says righteousness is no longer generated by human behavior, and yet supposedly Jesus is fully man. He supposedly he lived fully as a human being. So then how was righteousness no longer generated by his behavior? Jesus goes to John the Baptist and gets baptized, even though John the Baptist protests and says, rather I should be baptized of you. But Jesus says, let it be so now, so that we may fulfill all righteousness. So he seems to be saying, look, we need to get baptized because this is the righteous thing to do. So there, the human being chose to be baptized in order to perform a righteous deed, according to the Christian narrative. But where this gets obscured or concealed is in the Christian confusion about the nature or structure or relationships of the various figures in their Godhead, being three in number, and the resulting Trinity doctrine. So that routinely Christians will say Jesus is God, just right off the top. Jesus is God. They don't attempt to qualify that statement at all. They don't care that that's not how the New Testament speaks in places. They just gloss it right over with Orthodox Christianity's confession that Jesus is God. So then that completely obscures the fact that Jesus would have had to have been at some point a human being doing righteous acts as a human being. Anyway, it's a logical fustercluck. It's a logical orgy. And Gentiles love their orgies, so it shouldn't surprise us. But if you just go back to the Hebrew Tanakh, things make so much more sense. You don't need all that confusing Christian baggage in order to serve the deity of the Bible. It was all right there. It was all right there until the Roman Flavians invented the Christian myth. You had this big court of the Gentiles, where Gentiles were making pilgrimages from even beyond the Roman Empire and bringing their offerings to the Creator to demonstrate that they believed in this monotheistic God. And none of them needed any Christian baggage to do that. Anyway, let's see. Imputed righteousness. The New Testament argues that a believer's legal standing before God is achieved because Christos' own status as a tzaddik is credited or imputed to them as so, whereas in the Hebrew Tanakh, a person's sins are not imputed unto their progeny, and I don't know, sometimes the narratives in the Tanakh, I question whether that's even the case. To me, it seems like there may be a contradiction there. And I probably don't understand the topic well enough, but here we're told that the righteous deeds of one human being are now imputed to all human beings, but only if they believe in him, only if they verbally confess publicly to the Christian community that they're abandoning those Jewish beliefs and they're getting on board with the Gentile program. Only then do they get that freebie righteousness. As Philip Melanchthon and later theologians summarized, believers possess an alien righteousness, a goodness that belongs entirely to Christos, but blankets the believer. So it's kind of like an oily righteousness or a greasy grace. It just, you shake Christos's hand, and that moisturizer kind of, sloughs off onto your hand, smears onto your hand, and now your hand has moisturizer on it. It's, his righteousness just blankets everybody. But again, only if you believe in him, only if you confess publicly to the Christian community that you believe in him, or at least to some representative of the Christian community. So it becomes this mystery cult, this initiation rite, this work that you have to perform in order to for this righteousness to also be accredited to you, or credited to you, I guess. The oh boy, dude. The shift from a righteous man to the righteous. While the text stops pointing to specific individuals and calling them a righteous person in the singular, excuse me, the New Testament frequently uses the plural form of dikaios to describe Christians post-crucifixion. Rather than singling out elite spiritual giants, the term is democratic and corporate. The prayers of believers, James chapter 5 verse 16 states, the prayer of a righteous person, dikaios, has great power. This is written directly to the early church network, meaning any believer operating in faith. Excuse me. Let's look at that passage, shall we? Because I think you're playing a little fast and loose in your interpretation of James chapter 5:16. Because James is like, of all of the epistles of the New Testament, James is most like the Hebrew Tanakh, and that's what we would expect from the leader of the Jerusalem congregation. So the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Now I thought there were, yeah, and again I've got to go to the Revised Standard Version. Elijah, or Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet, Elijah the prophet, was a man of like nature with ourselves, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on earth. Now, was Eliyahu Hanavi a Christian? No, he wasn't. Did the crucifixion happen yet in Eliyahu's time? No, it did not. Then he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth its fruit. My brothers, yeah, and then it just continues to some other topic without segue, apparently. So he's providing an example of someone who is not a Christian. So don't say that that the prayer of a righteous man has great power in its effects. Don't apply that to only Christians, because that's not what that verse says there. The final state, Hebrews chapter 12 verse 23, refers to the church as reaching the spirits of the righteous, dikaion, made perfect. Whatever. Daily living. So that's so that's a support for the idea that in Christianity, Christians are referred to as the righteous. Daily living. 1 John chapter 3 verse 7 notes that post-resurrection believers are expected to mirror Christos. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous as whoever practices righteousness is righteous as he is righteous. So I guess they're trying to say there that whoever practices righteousness practices. 1 John chapter 3 verse 7. Verse 7 or 37? 7. He who let little children let no one deceive you. He who does right is righteous as he is righteous. He who commits sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. And the reason that Jesus supposedly appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. No one born of God commits sin, for God's nature abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. Whew. And maybe that's why so many Christians commit so many sins, because, hey, I can't commit sin because I'm a Christian. By this it may be seen who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not do right is not of God, nor he who does not love his brother. Okay, so let's put this into a practical application. Okay, so what you're telling me is that if a Christian ever commits a sin, then he who is one who is not born of God. And then you're also telling me that the Christian who is supposedly born of God never commits a sin. Never. They never do. That every Christian who is born of God is perfectly righteous. That would seem to disqualify the majority of Christians to me, right? And it also puts us back in the situation before the crucifixion where, we're just looking at a person's works to determine whether they're righteous or not. So it seems like this righteousness that's attributed to the Christian, it kind of doesn't really have staying power. It doesn't really stick because they're still looking in 1 John at whether Christians are committing sin or not. And really, that's the reality. If you've ever hung out with these haughty, conceited, self-congratulatory Christians patting themselves on the back because they've spiritually arrived. No, I'm not talking about the sincere Christians who are humble and they're not elitist in their faith. They're not smug. They don't look at a Jew who's performing the works of the law and think that they're condemned to hell. I'm not talking about those jerks. Rather, I'm not talking about the one. I think I conflated the two there. I'm not talking about the sincere, humble, well-meaning, good-hearted Christians. I'm talking about the elitists who think that they've spiritually arrived and the other Christians haven't. I'm not talking about the Christians who are constantly preaching to their own congregations, calling them up to the altar to be saved when supposedly all the Christians there are supposed to already be saved. That's a cowardly kind of Christian outreach where you've got your little captive audience, so you're constantly questioning whether your own congregationers, your own congregants, are saved or not. So you're eternally calling the salvation of your Christ into question. But apparently that's something you need to do because you've got Christians in your congregation who are still committing sins. So this righteousness this Christian righteousness is really kind of elusive, and it's kind of a vapor that just evaporates when you really inspect the lives of these people. Now, there's a certain base level of goodness and ethical behavior that we expect in the West, in Western society, that where we can say that someone's is good. But the Gentile Western definition of a good person is not the biblical definition of a good person or a righteous person, right? So let's let's make sure we differentiate between the two of those. But our tendency in the West would be to look at a Christian, and if that Christian is doing the baseline expectation of what we see a good person to be in Western society, then we would accept them as, oh, that's a good Christian, right? But it's not because they're a Christian necessarily, it's because they're doing the very same thing that the non Christian member of Western society a few doors down is doing, right? So if that guy a few doors down is doing enough to be considered a good person in the West in Western society, then what's the big deal about the Christianity a few doors down in the other direction, where that Christian is meeting the expectations of Western society's definition of a good person? Did Christ do that for him? Or did he do that himself? So please, what this is suggesting is like the one who's truly born of God is going to be like perfect all the time, just like Jesus supposedly was. But that just doesn't happen, man. You know, there are probably some Christians in each church congregation that have a very good reputation, and their brothers and sisters consider them to be, you know, righteous people or good Christians, so that when they die, they have nothing but good things to say about them in their eulogies, or in their going away speeches. But this passage in First John seems to be talking like about some like really perfect person, and I just don't know too many of those. Now, I do know or have met Jews so observant in Torah that they're completely alien to members of Western society, because their righteousness is defined, the parameters of it are defined by the Creator's commandments. And whereas other people might be watching Monday Night Football or Family Guy, or what's that, Housewives, Desperate Housewives, or whatever that's called. You know, all these Western shows, you could see it on TV. It's entertainment is practically defined by lawlessness, law breaking, Torahlessness. You know, murder becomes entertainment, theft becomes entertainment, adultery becomes entertainment, fornication, entertainment, things that I'm not even going to mention, you know, because like the Westerner really seems to really dig a character who's, you know, he's in a gray area. He's not the old dualistic good guy, bad guy, what do they call that, dichotomy. He's not either the really good guy like Superman used to be, or the really bad guy like I guess like Snidely Whiplash or something. He's this gray area kind of guy, you know, he does good things, he does bad things, you know, and that makes him more real for me, you know, because he's more like me, because I do good things and I do bad things. So this character just seems so much more real to me. But but then we start really loving these characters that are gray, who are doing all these bad things, but they're also doing good things. So then we're constantly weighing their character in the scales, and it's never really tipping to one side or the other, so that we can either say, oh, he's just this goody two shoes that I can't identify with, or he's this really despicable, wicked person that I'm not even going to watch this show anymore, right? And this is what Westerners are calling entertainment. Do you know what's entertainment for a Torah observant Jew? Studying God's law and the commandments of the law and learning how to do those commandments more perfectly. That is what the child of Israel, who is Torah observant and living the Torah, does. He spends his time studying the Torah. That's his culture. That's his lifestyle. He doesn't need to turn around and start watching Dexter on TV because a serial killer who kills other serial killers is just such a cool idea. and I find it so entertaining. A person who kills killers, you know, it's the amount of blood spilled on TV. And then people in America or in the West, we wonder, how did our society get like this? And we can sit there and we can say, oh, Hollywood is actually Holly weird, and Hollywood is so corrupt, and Hollywood is so evil, and it's teaching us so many bad things, and yet we're tuning into the television shows anyway, because they always manage to come up with some new idea for a TV show that grabs us. And maybe we're watching television shows where we get to watch like narcissistic people being evil to each other, and then that becomes our entertainment. If our appetite is for these lawless ways of living, then that's who we are, people. That's who we are. Because if you were really a righteous person striving to live righteously according to God's law, you would be studying God's law instead of watching that Gentile TV show. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. We'll have to do another part. We're at page 10, so we only have about 6 more pages left after that. But we've covered some of the Christian perspective on this, and you can be certain that I'm going to push against these ideas, as I did just in this video. But yeah, I'm going to be pushing against these ideas with the AI, and you're going to, I think, find that the AI is going to agree with me on some points.